Hey there, and welcome to part three of our recap. And so, picking back up where I left off, we're still talking about Aristotle's definition of tragedy. And where we left off, he was talking about where with incidents arousing pity and fear. Understanding that, digging into that is talking about obviously feeling, having a connection, feeling for the main character. The audience, as we are watching it, should also feel afraid for the hero as they move toward their destructive end. And again, while we may know that the character uh, did it unto themselves a lot of times, um, that's the whole point though of drawing in, because what it does is humanizes the character to us, right? And so as we read Macbeth, how did we feel about him, right? Were we drawn to him? Did we feel sorry for him? Did we empathize with him? Were at any time did we see ourselves in him, even if it was just a little bit, right? Can we identify with his situation? Can we identify with being easily influenced by people, especially people who are close to us, because that's what happened to him, right? And so when Aristotle talks about the catharsis, that was the last part of his definition of tragedy. The catharsis is simply the resolution of the play or the denouement. It's what happens. It's the end. It's all of the different things that brings the play to a close. All right, ties up all those loose ends of the plot, which is important. So let's talk about the elements of a tragedy that Aristotle pointed out, because this is also important. Again, this is something that he observed while watching Greek tragedies. And so he felt that, first of all, the action of the play, its plot, was the most important of these six elements. Okay, and I'm doing these in order of importance as he identified them, right? And so he said, all human happiness or misery takes the form of action. Character gives us qualities, but it is in our actions, what we do, that we are happy or miserable. So, first, when it comes to the plot, first there must be unity of plot. He's already talked about this in the definition. There has to be one complete action. It can't be too many things going on at one time, or you're going to lose the audience. Any events or episodes in the scenes must be necessary to the main issue, and it has to be probable. It has to be believable, right? A good plot has discovery or peripety. That's a crazy word. I guess it's very hard. Or sometimes both. Peripety is the change from one state of things at the beginning of the play to the exact opposite by the end of the play. And so this could be something like the change from being rich to poor. Um, from being powerful to being powerless, or from being a ruler to a beggar. But the change that takes place in a tragedy should take the main character and maybe even some other characters with them from a state of happiness to a state of misery. Okay. Discovery is a change from ignorance to knowledge. I didn't know, to okay, ha, an epiphany, right? This often happens to the tragic hero who starts out very clueless. They don't know, you can see that they're kind of lost along the way, and they learn how they created the mess that they end up in at the end of the play. And we saw that with Macbeth in a big way. Change. The third thing is change. Change by itself is not enough. The character involved in the change must have specific characteristics to arouse tragic emotions of pity and fear, though. So Aristotle points out that there are three forms of plot that should be avoided. And the first is a totally good man must not pass from happiness to misery, because he can't be a totally good man because it's not believable. We're going to be mad as the audience that bad things happen to this totally good man because there's no merit to it. There's no point. Why is this totally good man being treated like this? This doesn't make any sense. The audience is not going to pity him. They're not going to identify with that. That's unreasonable. It doesn't make sense. And a bad man can't pass from misery to happiness, because we won't, as the audience, see we won't see that, because we don't want to see evil being rewarded. Think about that, right? And a bad man cannot pass from happiness to misery either. Why? Because the audience is going to feel like, oh, he got what he deserved. It's everything that happens to the tragic hero has to be believable and realistic in some way in order for us to connect with them, and empathize and have that fear of pity, and things that a tragic hero has to have. So a tragic hero cannot be too good, he can't be too bad, but he has to end up in some type of misery. So the best tragedy, according to Aristotle, centers on a basically good man who changes from happiness to misery because of some great error. So he may have a good quality like pride that gets out of hand. Like with Macbeth, ambition, it just got out of hand. Okay. The fourth thing about plot is that the plot of a tragedy also involves some horrible or evil deed. In Macbeth, obviously, we see that he becomes a murderer. The tragic hero either does it consciously, does it out of ignorance, or mediates it, makes it easy for the deed to happen. For the audience to be horrified by the evil deed, the evil has to be done to someone important to the tragic hero. So he kills his cousin Duncan to become king. If the hero kills his enemy, so what? It's not a bad deal. Just got rid of the competition. Okay. On the other hand, if the hero kills someone he doesn't even care about, again, so what? The audience, we don't care. Okay. To make it really horrible for the audience, Aristotle suggested that the evil deed should be done to a family member. In the case of Macbeth, the king was actually his cousin. So that's a family member. When it comes to character, character is the second most important element of tragedy. Each character has an essential quality or nature that is revealed in the plot. And so the moral purpose of each character must be clear to the audience. Dramatis personae. We have a list of the characters and it tells us about those characters. So the characters need to have four main qualities. The first one is no matter who they are, hero or slave, the characters must be good in some way. Banquo was a good guy overall. The characters should act appropriately for their gender and station in life. Lady Macbeth, even though she was like, I gotta do what I gotta do because my husband seemed like he can't pull this off. The characters have to have believable personalities. Lady Macbeth was no joke about who she was and what she did, and she brought all of that to the character. She's really serious about who she was. Same thing with the witches. And each character must act consistently throughout the play. The witches did that for sure. Macbeth did that for sure. Nothing should be done or said that could be seen as acting out of character or odd or out of the way. Again, we won't believe them as the audience. So let's talk about thought. According to Aristotle, thought is the power of saying whatever can be said and should be said at each moment of the plot. So, do the lines spoken by the actors make sense? Are they saying what should be said at each particular moment in the play? It's really talking about the dialogue, the lines. Hello, the parts of a play. We have acts, scenes, and lines. So when it comes to thought, he's really talking about the lines, the dialogue. Diction is the actual composition of the lines that are recited. And so we're talking about when we watch the videos about the annotation and they were talking about the pentameter and the count and the pace and different things like that. Diction is the actual composition of the lines that are recited, right? And so thought deals with what is said, diction deals with how it's said. So there are many ways to say something. But a good playwright composes lines that say something extremely well. In a good play, some lines are so well constructed that the audience can leave the play quoting the lines exactly: to be or not to be, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Like there are so many. Okay. Melody and spectacle are the two least important elements of a tragedy according to Aristotle, and that's why they're last. And so the Greeks sometimes use, again, musical accompaniment. Sometimes parts of the play were sung. And so when it comes to melody and spectacle, in particular, Aristotle said that the music, which is the melody, has to blend in with the play appropriately. You can't have humorous music, a humorous tone in a play like Macbeth. That would not fit. Where would that fit? Right? Most of that music and theme would be very ominous. Okay, because the overall mood and tone of the play is very ominous, it's dark. Okay, that makes sense. Again, as with melody, spectacle refers to the staging of the play, stage props, things that need to make sense. It has to be appropriate for the theme of the play, but also an important the time period. This is not where, when it comes to spectacle, there's any type of creative license to do whatever no. Okay, that's not an adaptation. We're not talking about an adaptation. We're talking about the elements of a tragedy as told by Aristotle. Okay. Now, when we get into this part about Shakespearean tragedies, we're talking about the qualities of a tragic hero here. And so, a tragic hero is a dramatic character who brings about their own downfall by an error of judgment or personal flaw. Okay. That's hamartia. And to evoke this response, from an audience, the hero must display six common characteristics: flaw, an area of judgment. Again, that's hamartia. That makes the hero relatable to us, but it's also the direct cause of their downfall. But we can see that it humanizes them for us, and that term comes from a Greek word hamartinon, meaning to err, make mistakes. Let's talk about hubris. It's literally excessive pride and arrogance. Um, that word is derived from hybris, hybris, and it means insolence or outrage so great, like it has to be so great that it provokes the anger of the gods. Okay. Peripetia, from a Greek term meaning to fall around or a sudden change, is an abrupt reversal of fortune. It has to be quick. Anagnorisis is the moment the hero realizes the situation was caused by their own doing. This term is based on the Greek word for recognize. Okay. Nemesis is the inescapable fate the character is bound to suffer as punishment. So in Greek mythology, Nemesis was the goddess of vengeance. Okay. And so when it comes to catharsis, meaning to cleanse or purge, that is the emotional pity and fear that we, the audience, feel for the character. Goes back to Aristotle's definition of the word tragedy. It fits that in talking about the tragic hero, that we would have catharsis. Okay. That's the punishment handed out by fate. And that's greater than that punishment is greater than what the tragic hero deserves. Maybe, but that's what happens. Okay. Now let's get into a reminder of the themes and symbols in Macbeth. And I've already talked about here the main theme of ambition, because all of the other ones really kind of build from that, and it is ambition. Obviously that is a major theme throughout Macbeth, in particular how unchecked ambition goes and becomes monstrous, because we know that ambition is not bad. It's good to want to pursue, okay, things. It's good to want to have a desire to want more. But what happens is, because we see other characters in the play that have ambition. Banquo had ambition, but he didn't have ambition to the point that I'll do whatever necessary to achieve my goals. He didn't act on it the same way that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth did, right? And so Banquo had a mind of his own. Duncan and Macduff were all ambitious in their own ways, but in particular, they did it, they went about it differently. And so a lot of the characters wanted to be great leaders. In particular, again, Banquo, Duncan, Macduff, Malcolm, but they refused to allow ambitions to compromise their honor. Whereas with Macbeth, we see what happens when he had unchecked ambition. He just became a monster. Because what happens is you're never truly satisfied. It's just like greed. And even though we didn't talk about greed as a theme, it's pretty much like greed. When ambition just goes unchecked, that monster just destroys everything in its path. Okay. Fate would not be a theme without the witches or the weird sisters and their prophecy. The witches' characters make us the audience, and even other characters in the play, because even like Banquo, for instance, question whether fate is real, because he was just like, he said, yeah, we heard this, but apparently you're also supposed to be the thing in the corner, or that man's alive, and are you seriously buying this foolishness, right? So he just even questions a lot of what the witches were about. And so throughout the play, different characters answer the question about whether fate is real. And eventually we get rather an ambiguous answer because everybody feels differently about it. Banquo doesn't try to master fate like Macbeth does. Macbeth takes matters into his own hands, leaning into his ambitions a little too much, and then he ends up killing his cousin Duncan. But what Macbeth doesn't realize is that you cannot control fate. So he spends the rest of the play fighting against the parts of the witch's prophecies that he didn't necessarily like or that didn't favor him. And so, like for instance, the part where it said that Banquo's sons would be kings. Well, how is that possible if Macbeth is going to be king, right? What we never find out because they don't ask the question is king of what? Where am I going to be king and when? You don't ask questions, you don't get what you need to make informed decisions. So you're just out here doing what have you, right? And so that whole part about Banco's sons being kings, they said Banco himself would not be king, but his sons would be king. So what happens? That's a problem for Macbeth. So he kills his friend. He kills his friend Banquo and his whole family so that doesn't come true. And guess what ends up happening? His sons still end up becoming king. King James of the King James Bible is a descendant of Banquo, or it's said that he is. So Macbeth's quest to control fate at the hands of ambition leads him down this dark path, and it still blows up in his face. And so, is it surprising that violence is a theme? Absolutely not. The play opens in a time of war, and war itself is violent. And so that violence from the war foreshadows the violence that we will see in the play, um, and just how ominous and dark everything is. When we talk about nature and the unnatural or good versus evil, because we see that, that's definitely identified in the play. Remember that again, I said this earlier, during medieval times, that nature was directly connected to the country. Like when it was right with the kingdom and the king's house, it was right with society and nature. And so there was like this balance, this harmony. But when Macbeth decides to kill the king, he disrupts that harmony and everything in the kingdom is thrown off. And it just, now we have chaos. Nature is interrupted, unnatural things happen. They start having earthquakes, and animals are going crazy, eating themselves and each other, and all kinds of nonsense is going on top of that. You have the supernatural presence of the witches. And finally, manhood. And we see that thrown in Macbeth's face in the conversation with Lady Macbeth, but really, manhood is challenged throughout the play with different characters discussing or even debating manhood. The biggest one, obviously, is between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, but um, there are others. Because remember, Macbeth really didn't even want to kill Duncan. This was Lady Macbeth. She took that prophecy and really was like, well, if you're not going to do it, like, what's the problem? She really did an ego check of him. And so her encouragement led him to really make that final decision. We see manhood in Banquo with Banquo's decision to not support Macbeth in his plot to kill the king. Macbeth's like, man, no, I'm not doing that. He thought for himself. But that was part of being a man. My ego is not fragile. I, I'm going to stand up for what I know is right and honor myself. We see it with Macbeth as he's constantly questioning and examining his own manhood throughout his challenges that he faces, the consequences of his decisions and actions, even moving forward throughout the play. So when we start thinking about these things and looking at these things, it's so important that we continue to make sure that a lot of these things make sense. So the symbols in Macbeth. Okay, so first of all, we always had, obviously, as we know, our visions and hallucinations. Remember that Macbeth is a psychological thriller that Shakespeare likes to delve into that. And so frequently we see that Macbeth, the protagonist, he is the main character, sees or hears things. There's even a scene where he sees this floating dagger, and that symbolizes his violent choices and ambition. He sees Banquo's ghost. He thinks he hears a voice calling him a murder in his sleep. Even Lady Macbeth was hearing things. She became an insomniac. These are signs of a guilty conscience. Okay? Then there's blood. Blood represents violence. So we see the connection between the symbol and the thing. And so it also symbolizes the house of Macbeth's guilt. Sleep symbolizes innocence, purity, and peace of mind, something that Macbeth murdered himself when he set everything in motion. When he killed the king, now he and his wife can't sleep. Insomnia. And then eventually what happens? Lady Macbeth starts sleepwalking and having nightmares. Okay. The candle, something that Lady Macbeth strives for. She was, or specifically the light, represents goodness and something that she no longer has. That goodness was snuffed out when they, because she was a conspirator to it, killed the king. And they plummeted their life and their household into darkness. And so she's trying to escape the guilt and this darkness, but she can't. And that's the significance of the candle and the light from the candle. And then weather symbolizes the natural order of things. And so when the storm is brewing, something's not right. And we see how, again, how ominous things are in the opening scene with the witches and the thunder and the lightning, and they're entering and all of that. And then the weather itself changes after Macbeth kills the king. And we see that in a lot of what happened in the thunder and the lightning, but also in the earthquakes and all of the crazy things that happened with the day, with night becoming during the day. And that's why people believe that witches can make night occur during the day, all kinds of stuff. All right. Now, let's get into adaptation. Adaptation is a new take on an existing piece of work. Most of the time, we see this in film, but it can occur in theater. But we see this most of the time in film. A film transfers a dramatic or literary narrative into cinematic form. So adaptation involves different texts and interpretations. The canonical text is the original work, as is, no changes, just as is. old world language and all. It's not necessarily a starting point for creativity, it's just the original text. Intertext are previous adaptations, though. Okay, so when we, for when we first started watching Macbeth, we started with Roman Polanski's 1971 adaptation of Act One, Scene One, and then along the way, we watched several different versions of Act One, different scenes though. But most recently, I believe the last adaptation we saw of Act One, Scene One, and it was actually Act One, Scene One, and Scene Two of Apple TV's version featuring Denzel Washington. We also saw Sir Ian McKellen as Macbeth in the Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow Act Five. In the Act Five scene, we also saw Denzel Washington's version of Act Five as well. So, when it comes to cultural context, we're referring to social justice concerns, whereas pragmatic concerns focuses on things like market censorship. And so, with each interpretation of a script or play, which is the original text, we're talking about the canonical text, we gain a different perspective or even a new perspective. And so, this adds to the broader conversation around the work. And Shakespeare is often at the center of film adaptations. Shakespeare played an important role in the birth of film as an art form. Directors of silent film drew on the canonicity of Shakespeare to validate and even legitimize their new art form when only theater was widely regarded as highbrow. And this is Professor Jubin. Um, and so she goes on to say, since Shakespeare wrote for the stage, there are some structural differences between theater pieces and screenplays. Notably, Shakespeare follows a five-act structure in developing the dramatic narrative, proceeding from an introduction, action may begin in medias, audiences are dropped into the middle of an unfolding story, and proceeding through rising tensions to a climax and some form of resolution, the denouement. Okay. And so let's get into really understanding a little bit more about pragmatism. Um, So, pragmatic concerns in film adaptation involve balancing the fidelity of the source material with the practical needs of a visual medium, and that includes adapting to cultural nuances, humor, and idiomatic expressions for a new audience. Key concerns include preserving the original meaning and intent while overcoming the limitations of the new format. And that includes like converting into internal monologues into visuals or adjusting dialogue to fit within the time constraints of the film. And so this process requires creative solutions to ensure comprehension and a successful translation of the story's pragmatic, social, and emotional dimensions. And so Professor Jubin, also, excuse me, this is Kadirjan Ugli, says pragmatic adaptation in film text ensures the preservation of language and cultural characteristics. It involves adjusting linguistic elements in translation to fit the context of meaning and communication. The primary goal is to convey the intent of the original text comprehensively to target the audience. That's pragmatism. Okay. And